Hello and welcome to Unstress. I'm Dr Ron Ehrlich. Today we're going to focus on environmental stress and then move into extreme wellness and what that actually means. Now, I know we hear a lot about environmental issues, particularly chemicals and chemical exposure, but I think it's good to have some broad principles about how to think about this issue, rather than just tell you what to think about it. My guest today is Professor Marc Cohen. Now, Marc is one of Australia's pioneers of integrative and holistic medicine and has had a significant impact on education, research, clinical practice and politics. I think in the world of health and wellness, he's a legend. Marc has been involved in research into wellness as well as complementary and integrative medicine for more than 2 decades. He's gone over a broad range of topics, including the environment and wellness. His research interests are integrative medicine, acupuncture, yoga, just to name a few. This is a really extraordinary conversation. There's so much here. We do have transcripts available on my website, as we do for every episode, so please use them. There are often articles that we've mentioned or links to websites. They're also included. It's a great resource, so don't forget to go and visit the website, my website, drronehrlich.com. Now, when we think about stress, as you know, I define it as anything that has the potential to compromise your health. And if you're a regular listener, you will know we look at environmental stresses from lots of different perspectives. What I love about today's episode is Marc gives us a framework for really understanding the issue in a very broad and holistic way. He refers to it as the 10 toxic truths. Now, this topic can get a bit depressing and overwhelming, but don't be. Don't be depressed or overwhelmed. In order to fix a problem, you've got to actually know what that problem is. Now, when I ask him to give us some tips about how to deal with those toxic truths, listen carefully for the 5 Bs. That's right, Bs. Oh, look, I'm not going to give that anything away just yet. These are pearls. You've got to listen to it. So then after we deal with those issues, we go on to talk about extreme wellness. Marc has been following the work of Wim Hof, an extraordinary man who holds over 20 world records for doing some fairly extreme things around controlling his body's nervous system, temperature control, immune system, and much, much more. That's Wim, W-I-M. And I've been really interested. Going to his workshop in Sydney is going to be a fascinating thing, and Marc's talking about it. Now, Wim has developed a new breathing method, and we've talked a lot about breathing on this show, but this is different, and in particular, the confrontation with cold and its health benefits. Now, Wim goes to extremes, but there are some important lessons to be learnt for us all, particularly about dealing with stress, building resilience, boosting your immune system, and really taking control in ways you may not have even thought possible. So it's clearly an important message for us all. As I said, there's so much in this episode. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Professor Marc Cohen. Welcome to the show, Marc.
Well, thanks, Ron. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Marc, supermarkets and shops, pharmacies, they're full of products with a huge list of ingredients, which include chemicals. And I guess most of us just assume that if they're on the shelves, if they're on the market, they've been tested. But that's not always the case. Should we be concerned?
I think we should be afraid. We should be very afraid because most of the products on our shelves, most of the chemicals in those products have not been tested for safety, for human safety. And, if you're actually reading a label, it means you're reading something with a packaged product that has been processed. And there are so many different industrial chemicals that are added intentionally to products, this is the full range of products, whether it's personal care or furniture or whatever we use in our home. But, there's fire retardants, there's pesticides, there's all sorts of preservatives that are toxic to our health, and they accumulate over our lifespan, and they're not tested in a large part for human health. And then there's other chemicals that are inadvertently added that are just contaminations and are there by accident. It is a concern, and if we look at the trajectory of human disease, cancer has now overtaken heart attack and stroke as the biggest killer on the planet, and the biggest killer in Australia. That's not a genetic change or anything. This is due to there's more carcinogens around us. We're seeing cancers in younger and younger populations, as we are with obesity and diabetes. We're getting type 2 diabetes now in children, where it used to be in your fourth or fifth decade of life.
I've read and heard you say that there are a staggering 140,000 chemicals out there in the world?
Well, they're the ones that are commercially produced. So they're the ones that we produce. So there's literally millions more that we produce inadvertently. Every time you burn something, you create smog, and that's full of fine particulates and different chemicals. But then, in terms of the commercially produced chemicals, 140,000 plus. A lot of them, I think, more than 3,000 produced in high volumes, which means many millions of tons produced every year. And I think we've come to a situation where we have mass production of products, and with products that have to be mass produced and then distributed and shipped and sold on price point to be the cheapest possible product, that then those products have to have useful lifespan, and they have to be fit for purpose. But often it's not thought about how we dispose of them, so the recycling's not thought about it. But to mass produce products like that, often it's cheaper and easier to use different chemicals to preserve them, to produce them, to distribute them. And we're living in a toxic world, unfortunately. But that's inevitable. You can't get away from entropy.
Now, Marc, you've come up with a way for us to better understand the issues around environmental stress and technology with your toxicity, with your technology perhaps too, with your 10 toxic truths. Could you share those with our listener?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is something I was coming up with, and I really did this to make sense of everything for myself, and trying to look into the literature of what do we really know about toxic chemicals. What is the uncontroversial, scientific state of our knowledge. So what do we know and what we don't know? And coming up with this, and I've been lecturing on this for many years now, and it's researching this and understanding this is really depressing. So I just want to give a warning to your listeners here, because once you know this stuff, you can't unknow it. I mean, you can try and suppress it and push it down and try and forget about it. Just like we try and forget about the fact that 4.6 million children will die every year from malnutrition, and half the world live on a few dollars a day, and a third of the world don't have water to bathe. I mean, these are all truths everyone sort of knows somehow in the back of their mind, but we don't think about. We can become aware, and then we can start to put our house in order. So that's just the sort of the warning there. That, and it's and for sort of personal issues going through this, because it's really depressing to find out how toxic we are. So just in brief, because this has been well covered, and there's an article in Organic Gardener magazine which goes through it in a bit more detail. But so the 10 toxic truths, and they're sort of, I put them into pairs, because it used to be thought that the dose makes the poison, and that was based on Paracelsus 500 years ago came up with this sort of truism that it's the dose that makes the poison. Everything can be poisonous. But now we know it's not just the dose that makes the poison. It's the type of chemical, it's the type of or toxicant, the type of toxic exposure. It is the dose, but it's also the timing, the combination, and luck. And the luck is the luck of who your parents were and your genetics, and the luck of where you live, and industrial accidents or the exposures around where you live. So they're the 5 things, and the toxic truths sort of map to those. So when we go through them, the first toxic truth is that everyone is affected, and we don't really know the full extent. So that's the first 2. So everyone's affected, and there's no living thing on Earth that doesn't have industrial chemicals embedded in a DDT and fire retardants. And the biggest survey that we have of toxic chemicals in humans is done in the US, the NHANES study, and they found things like fire retardants and BPA in more than 90% of the population. And the full extent is unknown because we don't measure this. It's we're not really doing a survey. Out of the 140,000 chemicals, they measure about less than 300. So we don't really know the full extent, and all we can do is see the effects. So that's about the type of chemicals. And then to do with the dose, tiny doses can have big effects. So we know that there's the ability of non-linear dose response curves, and that's where you have an effect on, say, an endocrine system. So endocrine disrupting chemicals can affect your hormonal system, which then has a massive effect on your body. So even with a very small dose, just like a very small dose of a hormone has a big effect on your body, it's the same with toxic chemicals that affect our hormonal system. So tiny doses can have big effects, and the tiny doses actually biomagnify up the food chain. And that's where, you get a toxic dose of microplastics or pesticides or whatever it is into a phytoplankton that then, a zooplankton will eat the phytoplankton and concentrate that, and then the shrimp will eat the zooplankton and concentrates, and then the little fish eat the shrimp, and the bigger fish eat the little fish. As you got the food chain, you get huge biomagnification. So it can be up to 10 million times the levels in the top of the food chain. And that, predatory fish, predatory birds, predatory mammals, and of course at the very, very top of the food chain is the human infant. Because by eating breast milk, the human infant is eating, the products of humans. So, human infants sitting at the top of the food chain have the highest exposure and certainly in terms of lipid-soluble, fat-soluble chemicals, which is very, high in breast milk. And breast milk's been studied all over the world as a marker for exposures. And wherever they've studied it, they've found them. And this is true, for example, even in, say, New Guinea highland women who live at 2,000 metres elevation, 2,000 kilometres away from any agriculture, and they've got DDT in their breast milk because it's part of the global biosphere and it comes down in the rain. It's a organochlorine pesticide used in the 60s, and that's what Rachel Carson was sort of talking about. Yeah, it's still everywhere. And the levels are going down. That's true. They're still used in some regions in limited capacity, and that's all the organochlorines, which, because they are persistent, they last in the environment for decades, were replaced by the organophosphate pesticides, which are less persistent but more toxic. So the organophosphates are based on, nerve gas. These are war chemicals, most of these. Fertilizers came out of munitions, explosives, and pesticides came out of nerve gas. Yeah, so these are essentially war chemicals. So then we've got the issue about the combination. So we know that in toxic truth number 5 is chemical cocktails are synergistic. It's worse to have a combination of chemicals than a single chemical. And that, there's an effect that's been well described, which is the something from nothing effect. And that's where you can have a dose of 2 different chemicals that by themselves do nothing, but yet put them together and they actually do something. And you think about the complexity, because no one's exposed to single chemicals. We're exposed to a whole cocktail based on our life history and our lifestyle. But when they test them one at a time, because it's just, you can't account for all the different combinations. But we certainly know that mixture toxicity is a thing. And, when you're exposed to a mixture, it's worse.
So if a toxic material, say mercury, has a toxic value of 1 and another chemical has a toxic value of 1, when you add them up, 1 plus 1 doesn't necessarily equal 2. In fact, it may be equal to a much higher number.
No, it might equal 5, yeah. We know some of the ways that can happen. So, for example, it might change the way it's excreted or the way things are metabolized. And often with herbal medicines and stuff, we can use that to our advantage. But with toxic chemicals, it can actually make them more potent. I mean, there may be some also counter effects that make them less potent, but generally mixtures are more toxic than single exposures. And the other side of that, toxic truth number 6, is that bioaccumulation occurs over the lifespan. So the combinations that we're exposed to, the input of these toxicants is greater than our ability to excrete them. So they basically accumulate in our bodies, and especially the ones that are fat-soluble, because we don't normally excrete fat, because fat's a very precious biological resource. We don't want to excrete it, we want to preserve it and use it. So these fat-soluble chemicals, build up in our body over our lifespan, and there's actually a theory that says the part of the reason, one possible reason for the obesity epidemic is obesity, and centripetal obesity, where you put the weight on around your belly, is a way of getting these toxic chemicals out of the general circulation and sort of diluting them. And that's our body's attempt to use the public health principle of the solution to pollution is dilution. So if you can't excrete them, you can dilute them by just putting on more fat. And of course, the fattiest organ in our body is our brain. And that it uses most of the energy, and it's 20% of all our energy gets used in our brain. That's where fat accumulates. And if we think about a fetus, a fetus doesn't have a lot of body fat, but they're all brain. Most of the fat in the fetus is in the brain. So these chemicals can pass through the placenta, there was a Canadian study that talked about babies being born pre-polluted, and then you get breastfed, and those chemicals come out through the breast milk. And I must say that breast milk is still the best possible food for infants, even though it has high levels of toxicants it can have. It is the best possible food. Although we also know that breastfeeding is a good way for the mother to detoxify, because you're excreting these sort of lipophilic toxicants, these fat-soluble toxicants from breast milk. And that we also know that if you are a second or third child, you get less toxic breast milk than if you're a first child.
Gosh, I hope my brother's listening to this because it explains so much. Mark, please go on.
Well, if you have an older sibling, you need to thank them because they took a toxic load. They took the hit for you, yeah. They're the most vulnerable, and they're also the most exposed. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But in terms of the combinations, it's worse to have combinations, and those combinations increase. And if you think about where people get cancers in later life, it's in the fatty tissue, the breast and the prostate and the bone marrow, etc.
So this idea that weight gain, apart from high carbs affecting hormones like insulin, etc., weight gain, the accumulation of fat, may also be a response to toxins?
Well, no, and fatty liver is, one of the consequences of that, where you build up, huge fat deposits within the liver. So, moving on, as I say, it becomes really depressing, but we know that windows of development are critical. It depends when you're exposed, and certainly here again, children are worse off, because if you're exposed during critical periods of development, when you're developing your organ systems or you're developing your cognitive pathways, and you're much more vulnerable. And they've actually done studies, for example, on organophosphate pesticides, which are the commonly used water-soluble pesticides, and they measured these levels in the urine of pregnant women in the third trimester, and they showed that the levels in the woman's urine while she was pregnant correlated with that child's intellectual development at age 7. So yeah, a very early exposure can have a latent effect. And then we also know that around the timing effect, that these effects are transgenerational. So what you're exposed to doesn't just affect you, it affects your children and your children's children and possibly your children's children's children, down up to 4 generations.
So this is epigenetics, where not just the thoughts we have, which are actually chemicals the body produces called neurotransmitters, but also foods and now chemicals can attach to our cell membranes and cause our genes to express themselves in a particular way, be it positive or negative.
That's correct, yeah. There are exposures, toxic exposures can have epigenetic changes that are then transmitted through the generations. And that's not just toxic exposure to chemicals. There's been a lot of research now on toxic exposure to events, like, post-Holocaust survivors and whole generations being traumatised by war or famine or different population events that have epigenetic transfer down the generations. We're still sort of mapping the ability of, on how they're actually transferred. There are studies that show that stress can actually, impact, 2 or 3, even 4 generations later. And finally, the last sort of 2 is that the risk that, of your having an impact it's not equal, it's unjust, and it's actually greatest for the young. So the risk factors, for children are much higher because, they have a longer latency period to develop disease. They've got vulnerable immune systems, detoxification pathways. They actually extract more toxicants from the food and the air because of their high metabolic rate, etc. So the risk of for children is much higher than adults, and also the risk is higher for more vulnerable populations, say people in poverty who live in industrial areas, people who don't have the resources, people who have malnutrition increases the risk, because if you don't have the right nutritional defences to feed your detoxification pathways and process things, so malnutrition, poverty, and young age are all increase the risk, and also it makes you more vulnerable. And finally, the exposure is unequal and unjust, and that accidents happen. So that again, how you're exposed, living in poor areas, being very young, and children have more hand-to-mouth activity. They, as I say, they extract more toxicants from their food. And they're crawling along the ground, where there's dust from diesel and there's pesticides and all of that. So there are many ways that the children have more exposure, and then accidents happen, and there've been massive industrial accidents that have exposed huge populations in every stage of the chemical cycle. So the BP oil spill and the Exxon Valdez disaster in Bhopal, where the pesticide factory exploded, and Fukushima, and Love Canal, and even Cranbourne in Melbourne, where they built a suburb on a toxic waste dump. So it really is where you are. I mean, there's no place on earth that's pristine, and in fact, I think in Europe, I was reading, there's more than 500,000 locations in Europe that are no-go areas for humans. These areas that are so toxic, through a lot of war chemicals, but also in industrial plants where they've used PCBs, etc. But these are areas where humans just cannot go because they're so toxic.
Okay, well, you warned us that this can be depressing, but a big part of solving a problem is becoming aware of it. And there's a lot of things we can do about it. I mean, we're constantly making choices, and there is hope.
Oh, I think there certainly is hope. And for all of these things, we can address these issues. So, while, toxicants are everywhere, I mean, nature has almost an infinite power to remedy and heal, that we can actually choose what we're exposed to positively by, choosing the products we buy, and choosing what goes into our mouth, and choosing what we bring into our homes, and choosing how and where we live. So we have an incredible amount of choice once we're aware of these issues to actually change our exposure levels, to choose to wear, protective clothing when we're using chemicals, etc. So there really is hope, and I think we've put a lot down to individuals to change things, and it does help for individuals to change things, but I think we have to change things at a societal level as well. And I think we're not aware of how much power we actually have. We think the corporations and the politicians are in power, but they're only in power because we give them power, and we can change that just as easily.
I mean, we get to vote every 3 or 4 years, and we might wonder what power that actually has, but we do know that money talks, so we can vote with our money.
And actually we get to vote even just with our attention, what we choose to focus on. And I think, in today's environment where, clickbait on the internet is trying to get your attention, and, there's a science about how much, dopamine they can make you secrete by different images and different headlines and false headlines that are just attractive. We actually can choose where we focus our attention. We don't have to, follow where we're led. We can actually choose where we want to go.
Okay, so we're aware and try and make sensible, informed choices, but detoxing ourselves is clearly a very important concept we should be doing. What should we be doing?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of thought on this, and I'm actually putting together a whole program. But the principles are very, very simple. One is, to stop putting the toxicants in the first place. There's no point just detoxing if you're going to keep on toxing. So, you want to reduce your toxic exposure. And I guess public health has always said that by, stop smoking, stop drinking. These are very simple ways of reducing your toxic exposure. And there are many others. So, but you want to, limit what goes in, and you want to keep your channels of elimination open. And when I talk about your channels of elimination, I talk about the 5 Bs. And that's your bladder, your bowels, your breath, your body, and your brain. So, for your bladder, you want to keep your body flushed, and you want to filter water. I mean, I think, there's a truism, if you don't use a filter, you are one. And I don't think we can trust the governments and, water supply companies to give us pristine water anymore. So, again, you want to stop the toxicants going in, so filter your water and then keep your body flushed. So you're peeing lots of straw-coloured urine, and there's lots of different herbal teas. I'm a big fan of Tulsi, holy basil tea, which enhances your detoxification pathways, but lots of herbal teas will actually be slightly diuretic and keep your body flushed with clean water. So that's your bladder. With your bowels, you want to keep your bowels open, so, high fibre diet to keep your bowels moving. I'm really a fan of intermittent fasting, and I think everybody does intermittent fasting because we don't eat while we sleep. But to give your bowels a break every day by maybe fasting 12 to 14 or 16 hours. So don't eat after 8 o'clock at night, and then don't eat again till 10 in the morning or 8 in the morning, or as you feel. So it gives your bowels a break. And then eating not just high fibre, but fermented products. So you're feeding your gut flora, that whole microbiome, which there's so much research about now. That's it. And a lot of the herbal products, research now on turmeric that shows that it's not just good for, to get into your blood, but it actually stimulates good bacteria and prevents bad bacteria growing in your gut. So eating, feasting and fasting, and the idea that the feast is in the first bite, and fasting overnight, and then eating fibre and fermented products. That'll keep your bowels clean and open. And then your breath, and that means trying to breathe clean air. So whether you're using air purifiers or if you live in the city, you need air purifiers. But if you don't, going out into nature and walking in the park or going to areas where there is fresh air. So that's the breath. Breathing clean air and making sure that that's clear. And then your body. And the way to clean your body, washing your hands is a very simple way. And they've even just shown office workers, if they wash their hands more frequently, 6 times a day, there are less fire retardants in their blood. And that's because your computers, your phones, all the plastics that are around you in your office, they're all made with fire retardants, because if you think about plastic's made from petrol, and petrol is highly flammable. So the way they prevent these things from being a fire hazard is they use brominated fire retardants, and they come off on our hands, and then we touch our mouth, and you don't need to touch your mouth to absorb. So just washing your hands is a big factor. And the other one I'm a big fan of is sweating. It doesn't matter how you do it, whether it's a sauna or going for a run or dancing or digging in the garden or whatever it is. But cleaning your body from the inside out. It's also keeping your body flush. It's clearing your skin. It's also a detoxification pathway. And one of my students, Dr Joy Hussain, is doing her PhD on saunaing and sweating and looking at the metabolomics of sweat and that you excrete heavy metals and pesticides and things actually in your sweat. And then finally, with your brain, it's keeping your mind open, trying to reduce toxic thoughts. And, if you've had toxic exposures, psychological exposures, dealing with those. But again, trying not to put toxic thoughts in. So, staying away from toxic people, staying away from the news, and just the whole barrage of toxicity that's in the mainstream media, and keeping an open mind, and then having time out where you're just really at peace with yourself. So that's just some simple practices that people can do to keep their channels of elimination open, and that'll will help to reduce the toxicity.
Okay, so we've talked about environmental stress and toxicity and how to keep our elimination or detoxification pathways open. I love that, the 5 Bs, which is clearly a major priority for us all in our modern world. Let's switch now. Let's talk about wellness, because I know that's been a major focus for you both professionally and personally over many years. How do we define wellness?
Oh, there are so many different definitions. People can have their own pet ones or academic ones, but wellness, it's where you look, feel, perform, and stay well. But wellness it's more than health. And one of the key things that I like to talk about is that wellness is not an individual thing; it's a social thing. There's a great story where Swami Satchidananda, who was the founder of Integral Yoga, was asked, what's the difference between illness and wellness? And he went up to the board where they were written and just circled the I in illness and the we in wellness and sat down. And that's puts in a nutshell that illness is about the individual, wellness is about the collective, it's about the we. You can't be well unless you're in a community and a society and a planet that is well.
Yeah, I heard you say this many years ago. You said it, and you said it earlier today, and it's stayed with me. It's really a simple message, but it's quite profound. We are all connected, so we are all affected. It's a kind of marriage in sickness and in health.
Yeah, so your wellness implies that not only are you healthy and well, but also your environment. and that there's harmony and synergy between your thoughts, your words and your deeds and the environment that you're in.
I know you've been very interested, as I have, in this internationally renowned Wim Hof, a Dutch extreme athlete known as the Iceman, for his ability to withstand extreme cold. He's got many world records, I think. Can you tell our listener a bit about him?
Yeah. Well, I met Wim just over a year ago now, and extreme wellness is, again, it's something that I've sort of coined the term, I guess, and putting together to improve my own understanding of some of these issues. And the way I frame that is to think about homeostasis. And I like to go back to first principles. And biology, as organisms, we try and maintain a constant internal environment, so our body temperature and our blood pressure and our blood sugar and all these different variables are maintained. We try to maintain them as a constant. And that's the whole process of homeostasis. And we have this, parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems that work through negative feedback to try and maintain a consistent level. Yet to find that point of balance, and if you really find that exact point of balance, this is sort of the state of bliss of, you're at one with the universe because you don't have to do anything if you're totally balanced. And either side of that, there's like a steady state where you can manage those variables quite well. And most people spend most of their life in that steady state. Certainly now in the modern world, we're very comfortable. We don't have to shiver or sweat. We can just go into a room and put the air conditioning on or the heater on or put a jumper on, or we travel in cars and they're air conditioned. So most people are in this steady state. And then there's outside that steady state is an adaptation zone where you actually have to actively do something, change your physiology, increase your blood pressure or heart rate or the way you think or what you do to actually adjust. And then outside that is this panicked zone or breakdown zone where you can't cope. And that's the limits of homeostasis. And it's at that limit of homeostasis, it's the edge of where you can cope with. It's a very interesting point because it's at that point where often you get this sense of flow where your whole body is engaged in a single activity. Because if you're in your steady state, your blood pressure can be doing one thing, your temperature can be doing one, and your thoughts can be, you're thinking about this or that, and you're not acting as a coherent organism. Whereas if you're at that edge of balance or edge of flexibility of what you can respond to, your mind, your body, your brain, your breath, all of that have to be working together. And we can explore that. And a lot of practices do explore that. In yoga, often you'll go to the edge of a stretch and you'll just breathe and stay there and focus your mind. And in doing that, if you go too far, you'll hurt yourself. But if you just go to the edge of where you're comfortable, you'll find that naturally your flexibility will increase and your strength will increase. So we can explore the edge of our adaptation in really basic ways. And I like to talk about the language of our cells. If you think about every cell in your body, it's full of mitochondria that, burn glucose and produce oxygen. And the language of our mitochondria and our cells is water and oxygen and carbon dioxide and temperature and glucose. That's the language of our cells. And we can modify each of those things consciously by modifying our environment.
Now the mitochondria are the power pack inside each of our cells.
Yeah, and that's the little factories where the glucose is burnt and with oxygen and made carbon dioxide is produced. Or if they burn without oxygen, then it's lactic acid is produced, lactate. So if we want to change those variables, and this is what Wim Hof does, well, he's discovered that through his method, the Wim Hof Method, which involves a breathing technique, gradual cold exposure, and mental focus. So it's very simple, and it's quite well documented. In fact, I think a couple of days ago, the latest study came out, fMRI studies of him and other people exposed to cold, and trying to understand how can he sit in an ice bath for nearly 2 hours. And he's got, I think, 26 world records for, climbing Kilimanjaro and Everest in his board shorts and running marathons in the Arctic Circle and deserts and all sorts of things. And he has incredible control over his physiology through these 3 disciplines of cold exposure, breath control, and mental focus. And his practices involve going to the extremes of, certainly the breathing practice, you go to the extremes of oxygenation and carbon dioxide buildup. And it's a very simple practice.
So this is so interesting. We've talked a lot on this show about breathing. I mean, we had Dr. Rosalba Courtney, who did her PhD on breathing, and also Patrick McEwen from the Buteyko Institute. And we're all discovering about how important breathing is in regulating our body chemistry, affecting our energy levels, how we sleep, even our posture. But this takes breathing to another level.
Well, one of the, when I say going back to basics, one of the things I like to talk about is the 5 phases or the 5 rhythms. And that's, I learned about them first in Chinese medicine, the 5 element theory, and then I studied martial arts, which talked about it, and then I discovered the 5 rhythms dance practice, which Gabrielle Roth talks about, and she describes flowing, staccato, chaos, lyrical, and stillness as these are the phases that anything in nature that transforms goes through. And our breath can do those. So the breath you're talking about, just the slow breathing through your nose, well, you're not even conscious of your breathing. We call that the flowing breath, or I call that the flowing breath. And then what Wim does, or his method, he goes through all these 5 phases of breathing. So from that flowing breath, you then make a decision to go into the staccato breath, which is in and out hyperventilation. So a big breath in and relaxed out. It's basically a panting type of breath. So it's very short, sharp, and you're doing it consciously. And if you do 30, 40, 50 of these big breaths in and then relaxed out, in and out breaths, then you'll blow away all the carbon dioxide, or you really reduce your carbon dioxide level. And after a couple of minutes, you'll start to get a bit lightheaded. And it's actually it's a little bit uncomfortable, the feeling, because you start to feel a bit dizzy and luminous and lightheaded. And what you've done is you've created what they call respiratory alkalosis. You've blown off your carbon dioxide, so your blood's become alkaline, and that changes a lot of the physiology within our body, because the alkalinity of your blood will control how tightly hemoglobin will bind to oxygen. So hemoglobin binds much tighter to oxygen when your blood is alkaline. So it drops your carbon dioxide and raises the oxygen level. Now, normally the oxygen level is quite high anyway, 96, 97, 98% saturation. So your hyperventilate will go to 99, which is as high as it'll go, and your carbon dioxide will drop. So it's like you've pumping these bellows, doing this hyperventilation. It's like you've stretching like a rubber band where you've pulled the oxygen up and or pulled the carbon dioxide down and the oxygen up. And so they're separated. And then you get to the point where you're a bit lightheaded, and with the Wim Hof method, then you'll then hold your breath. So you go from breathing as much as you can to not breathing at all. In the hold, that's chaos, because you don't know when you're going to release that breath. Again, it builds up energy, I guess, because with the breath hold, what happens is the physiology is still being unraveled, but first of all, you'll hold your breath for a lot longer than you ever would normally, because the drive to breathe is due to carbon dioxide buildup. And if you've blown off all your carbon dioxide, you don't have a drive to breathe. And it's really important that people don't do this underwater or operating machinery, because there's a risk of shallow water blackout. Because what can happen is, because your carbon dioxide is so low, you might not get a drive to breathe even until the point where the oxygen's so low that you'll pass out. So you just don't feel like breathing. But then if you pass out and you're underwater, people drown. Shallow water blackout is a known risk. And in fact, free divers, even though this will prolong their breath hold, they don't do this technique generally because of that risk of shallow water blackout. So they're holding your breath, and then what happens then is that you'll hold for maybe, a couple of minutes, but then the carbon dioxide will start to build up. And as that carbon dioxide build up, that urge to breathe will build up. And then it'll build up to the point where here you've hit another extreme. So when you stopped hyperventilating and held your breath, you were at the extreme of high oxygen, low carbon dioxide, and high pH, alkaline pH. At the end of the breath hold, the oxygen goes very low, the carbon dioxide goes very high, and the pH goes very high. sorry, very low. So you become back to acid. So you're going respiratory acidosis. And you can get the oxygen dramatically down. I've been doing this technique for over a year now, and I've started doing it with an oximeter. And because of the long breath hold, because there's low carbon dioxide, you don't feel like breathing, you can get your oxygen down to 60 or 50% saturation. Whereas in a hospital, if it goes below 90, the alarm bells will ring. And this is actually a technique. There is a technique called intermittent hypoxic training. And I remember about 10 years ago, I was with my brothers and we did a trip up to Everest Base Camp. And this is when I was working with Roselba, who was one of my PhD students, and she did a PhD on breathing. So Roselba was brilliant, and she put me onto this guy, Oleg, who has these hypoxicators, which are machines that feed you hypoxic air. So they take you to high altitude air, but just with a mask and an oximeter. And what they do is they take you, or they give you low oxygen air until your blood oxygen goes down, and then they bring you back up again, and you go backwards and forwards. So it's just for a very short period of time, you become hypoxic, and then you go back to normal, then you go hypoxic again for a short period of time, you go back to normal. And this is with quite a sophisticated device. And essentially that's what happens with this Wim Hof breathing, where you hold your breath and you can go quite hypoxic, but only for a very short period of time, and then you breathe again. And that's when you take the breath after your breath hold. That's sort of this chaotic release. And then you have these recovery breaths, which is the lyrical phase, where it's not the normal rhythm of breathing. It's quite a joyous state because you're relieved. You held your breath and now you're breathing again. And all your body chemistry starts to go back to normal. So your carbon dioxide will go back down and your oxygen will rise back up and the pH will normalize. And after a couple of minutes, a minute or two of normalizing, you get into this stillness phase, that final phase, where you'll find that your breathing it'll start to flow naturally, but it will be much less than it would normally. Your pulse rate will actually, for me, it's about 10 beats per minute lower than my resting pulse rate. So if my resting pulse rate's about 55, I can get it down to 40 or 42 with, in this peaceful breathing phase. And you also have this beautiful mental quietness. So you're in this really relaxed phase where you're hardly breathing, your pulse rate's going very low, and you're just in this, what I call actively doing nothing. It's a beautiful time to meditate or just to relax. And that's the still phase. So you've gone through the flowing where you're just unconscious breathing, the staccato where you're in and out, really pumping your breath, the chaos where you held your breath and then release it, the lyrical where you do the recovery breath, and then the stillness phase where you're hardly breathing at all and you're just in this really quiet physiological zone. Then you do another round. Wim, he talks about doing three or four rounds, yeah. It's incredibly easy, but it's also very rigorous. I mean, it's a discipline. I mean, to sit down to a session of breathing, you have to really have mental control. It's a very disciplined action to say, I'm going to now, do a round of breathing. I'm going to breathe in and out for 2 minutes, then hold my breath for 2 minutes, and then, recover and do another round. But what it does, it has a huge effect on your physiology. And at those points of deciding to do hyperventilation, at the end of the hyperventilation, and then holding your breath, and then at the end of holding your breath, there's a point where what I like to say is your mitochondria and your mind are on the same page. Your mitochondria are talking to your mind. So when you're hyperventilating, your mitochondria, they're really alkaline, and they're saying, what's going on? Stop this. And then when you're holding your breath, your mitochondria become hypoxic, and they're saying, what's going on? Stop this. So they're sending messages to your brain to say, take a breath.
Well, by the time people listen to this, I'll have done Wim Hof's workshop in Sydney, which you're also talking about. The idea of building resilience and controlling the autonomic nervous system, the stress response, is particularly appealing. I mean, not just to me, I think to everybody. Throughout my life, I've just hated the cold, particularly cold water. And clearly I'm not alone, but I've been having cold showers for the last few weeks. And honestly, I am amazed at how I've adapted.
The cold is an incredible teacher, and that's one of Wim's basic tenets. The cold is our warm friend. And one is we learned is that we're incredibly resilient. We're much more resilient than we think we are. And the other is that we can actually be in control of our autonomic nervous system. So if you think about your blood vessels, for example, and we talked about cancer is now the biggest killer, but the second biggest killer is cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis. And there's about 100,000 kilometres of blood vessels in our body, and they're lined with smooth muscle. But that smooth muscle is not under our voluntary control. It's part of the autonomic nervous system. So we can't normally exercise those smooth muscles lining our blood vessels. But if you force your body into the heat, they'll vasodilate. And if you force your body into the cold, they'll vasoconstrict. So you can open and close all those blood vessels in your body just by controlling your outside temperature. And one of the things I've been talking about for a while now and doing myself is doing hot and cold showers. And they call that actually a Scotch shower, and it's something that Ian Fleming wrote that James Bond does every day. I've been talking, I asked people, how many people take cold showers, and you find about between 10 and 15% of people just take cold showers because they've done it all their life and makes them feel good and they don't get sick. And there's groups of people all over the world who do ocean swimming all year round, even in the freezing waters, and a lot of them don't get sick that often. But with most people don't like cold showers. It's not a pleasant thing. So I've worked out a way to make it easier. What you find with if you do a hot shower first, then that vasodilates all your blood vessels, and you get the enjoyment of a hot shower. Because I've always loved bathing. I've always been a hot water person. And it was only a year and a half ago, just before I met Wim, that I discovered the power of the cold, really, to cold bathing. But then, if you're going to jump into an ice bath or a cold shower, it is a shock to the system. But what you can do is you have a hot shower, then you turn the heat right up so you feel like it's almost too hot, so you're very vasodilated. And then I've actually written this song and dance. It's called The Cold Water Hokey Pokey. So you've done your hot shower, and this is the hardest part. The hardest part is actually making the decision to do it. And I think you know that, you're at the edge of the swimming pool and the hardest thing is to jump in. It's going to be cold. But once you're in, it's sort of okay. But that's a bit of a shock. So you've had your hot shower, then you turn the hot water off, make the decision, turn the hot water off, the cold water on, and then you just wet your left foot and leg. And then your right foot and leg. Then your left hand and arm and your other hand and arm. And you keep on breathing calmly and you smile to yourself because that's what it's all about. And then you put your left side in, then your right side in, then your front side in, then you turn yourself around. Continue breathing calmly and smile to yourself. That's what it's all about. Then you put your whole head in, you move your whole head around, stand still, get a drenching, slowly turn yourself around. Continue breathing calmly, smile to yourself. That's what it's all about. And then you do the hokey pokey song and you go, oh, hokey pokey, and you put the water on your armpits. You put the water on your groin, put the water on your kidneys. And then you just have a dance in the cold shower and you'll find that you're dancing around in the cold shower. It's quite easy. And you've started your day singing and dancing and you feel really alive after that cold shower. But what that's done is by starting very slow just from your feet and your hands inwards, and starting from a point of vasodilation, what you've done is you've caused vasoconstriction and you've pushed the blood from your feet and your extremities, from your arms, into your core. So you've forced your arms and legs to vasoconstrict. So suddenly you've got all this extra warm blood in your core. And that's pushing blood through your organs. It's actually changing your cardiac output, but flushing your liver and your kidneys and all your organs with warm blood. So even though your limbs are now cold, you don't actually feel that cold. And then, you keep breathing calmly, and then you do your left side and your right side and your front side and turn around, and you're gradually lowering your skin temperature and vasoconstricting your periphery. So this is an exercise for all your blood vessels. And it's also an exercise for your willpower, because the decision to do it and actually doing it says that I'm happy to make a decision to be uncomfortable. I can be comfortable being uncomfortable. There's a whole process that's been, talked about more in physiology circles called hormesis. And hormesis, it's a process of where you have one sort of stress, and by exposing yourself to stress, it makes your stress adaptation mechanisms stronger so you can cope with other stresses later on. So exercise is hormetic. Exercise is quite stressful, you damage muscles and, it's stressful, but By exercising, it actually trains your body to then cope with the rest of life. So you get the same with cold exposure and with heat exposure as well. The same thing happens in a sauna, where you train your adaptive responses to stress. And that happens psychologically as well. So if you know that you're happy to make a hard decision and go into a cold shower and be a little bit uncomfortable, then when life throws you some stressful event, you say, oh, I can handle that. I can be comfortable in discomfort. And that's where this extreme wellness view comes in. So it's exploring your willingness and ability to be comfortable in what's otherwise an uncomfortable situation.
So it's a kind of therapy for your own stress response by retraining your nervous system, particularly your autonomic involuntary nervous system.
It is. And I think in the past, stress was seen as the enemy. So all this mindfulness training and meditation and relaxation and all this is saying that stress is the enemy. You have to oppose that stress. And chronic, uncontrolled external stress is the enemy. That's not good for you. But what this is saying is controlled, conscious, short-term, acute stress can actually be your friend because it trains you to cope with all this other stress that's out of your control.
Marc, this has been great. Before we finish, I just wanted to ask you what you thought the biggest challenge is for people on their health journey through life in this modern world.
Whoa, big question. So the biggest challenge, well, it's not physical. I think it's psychological. So I think the biggest challenges are psychological. Just like, having a cold shower, the biggest challenge is actually the psychological decision to do it. Because once you're in it and you're doing it, it's actually, you can cope with it, you can adapt to it very, very quickly. I think the biggest challenge is realizing how much power we have over our own life and over our own thoughts and exercising that power. We tend to go to the default position of being lazy, of letting someone else do the thinking for us, letting our devices or our clothes keep warm for us or cool for us. And we don't realise how much power we have over our own state of health and well-being and even of our thoughts. So, I think that's a challenge. How do we reclaim the power over our own thoughts and our bodies and exercise that power?
Marc, it's been terrific to chat with you. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Ron. Always happy to chat and look forward to seeing you at the Wim Hof events.
So there it is, 10 toxic truths, 5 B's, bladder, bowel, breath, body and brain, keeping those detoxification pathways open. It's empowering to know that you can significantly reduce the toxic load that you're exposed to by making informed decisions about the things you purchase. We've talked a lot about breathing also on this podcast from lots of different perspectives, but this is taking it to a completely another level. We have lessons to learn here about our potential, and I thought a really important point about using stress in a positive way, intentionally stressing our body to train our body to deal with stresses and to build resilience. I'm sure you've noticed it's a recurring theme, building resilience. Now, if you're not going onto my website to review the show notes, the transcripts of everything that you've just heard with links to articles, you should. They're a great resource. There's often so much information in these podcasts you may have missed that you can pick up again by, listening to it again, but reading the transcripts. Now, if you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a review on iTunes, and also I'm always open to suggestions and feedbacks. So, until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak